In our last lecture, we learned more about James Madison and the War of 1812. And in this upcoming lecture, we're going to be discussing the era of good feelings, which takes place between 1817 and 1829, and it spans through two presidencies, that of James Monroe as well as John Quincy Adams. And in particular, it's called the era of good feelings because there is really a reduction in sectionalist issues. There's a lot of compromises between various groups in the United States, and also there is the development of a one-party system, and so for the first time in American history, you don't have a lot of discord between various parties, and things are sort of evening out following the War of 1812, and there's this real rise in nationalism as a result of our supposed victory in this war. When James Madison left office in 1817, he was actually more popular than he was when he assumed the office in 1809, and there are several causes for this. The first and probably greatest of these being that the War of 1812 was, in the American mindset, a resounding victory for the United States, and in particular, the Battle of New Orleans was a point of pride for Americans. In addition, his presidency saw the death of the Federalist Party, which meant that there was much less sectionalism between New England, which had tried to secede from the Union at one point and to elect Aaron Burr as its governor, and between the southern states. And it also meant that there was less of an emphasis on states' rights over that of the federal government. So in general, this time period of peace is ushered in as he's leaving office. There's also a lessening of economic and political dependency on Europe after the War of 1812, which means the United States is far more self-sufficient. The kind of westward expansion that begins to occur as Madison is in his final year of office is also a result of manifest destiny and this belief that Americans have a duty to spread from sea to shining sea and to civilize the land and the people as they go. And this brings a great deal of optimism about the future of the country. And then lastly, there's really a rise in nationalism after the War of 1812. Americans, for the first time, regard themselves as Americans first and then as state citizens second. So they have a more national allegiance than ever before. Now, this demise of the Federalist Party was really confirmed in the presidential election of 1816, in which James Monroe won the presidency fairly easily. Monroe was really the first clear representative of a one-party system under the Democratic Republicans, and his term in office became known as the era of good feelings, in part because of the political cooperation that stemmed from one-party politics, and so there was much less partisan bickering back and forth across the aisle, and also because of America's high morale after the end of the War of 1812, and this kind of unifying nationalist spirit then will peak during the election of 1820, which Monroe will once again win for his second term as president. So James Monroe was the nation's fifth president, and he is also considered by most historians to be our last founding father of the United States. He was, importantly, the last president from the Virginia dynasty, and almost all of our founding fathers were actually from Virginia, except for John Adams, who was from Massachusetts, and he's also the final founding father of the Republican or Democratic Republican generation, before we'll begin to see a party shift in a couple of years. James Monroe was our last president who was also a veteran of the American Revolution, and he had a long and distinguished public career as a soldier, a diplomat, a governor, a senator, and a cabinet official before he became president. Once he became president, chose government officials from all areas of the nation and from both parties, despite the fact that the Federalist Party was beginning to decline. And he led this new kind of vibrant nationalism that really superseded partisan politics for the first time. And Actually, he takes a goodwill tour of the country in 1818, and he was universally acclaimed by citizens living in all sections of the nation. Now, there are several reasons that Monroe's election in 1816 really helped put the nail on the coffin of the Federalist Party, and these could include the disloyalty that others perceived New Englanders during the War of 1812 and the Federalists as having in particular, because many of them didn't want to fight the war in the first place because they were still economically viable. Also, there were liabilities in the form of this very extreme sectionalism regarding the interests of New England, and the fact that at one point through the Essex junto, an entire group of New England businessmen and politicians had wanted to completely break apart from the United States and form their own country, and they actually first asked Alexander Hamilton to be their governor, and when he turned them down, that's when they asked Aaron Burr, who has been accused of treason twice, because after that, Aaron Burr also attempted to get some of the western states, including Louisiana, to secede from the Union. He's a very interesting figure. And then lastly, it's probably important that Thomas Jefferson adopted a lot of the Federalist ideas. For example, if you remember, he kept Hamilton's financial plan, the 5-point plan, and he, in many cases, was quite loose in his interpretation of the Constitution. So there was really no need for a Federalist Party if the Democratic Republicans, like Jefferson, were going to start bringing their ideas into their own party platform. However, I think it's safe to say that the era of good feelings is something of a misnomer because there are some pretty serious issues that are beginning to divide the nation in this time period. The first Bank of the United States, the charter was allowed to lapse, and so there were various factions arguing for and against a new Bank of the United States. The tariff of 1816 is going to be something that becomes incredibly controversial as part of the American system, as are this desire for internal improvements and the fact that when these improvements are made on American infrastructure, they're made mostly in New England, and this really neglects southern states and western states. There's also some contention over the sale of public lands, and certainly the economic panic of 1819 is going to cause a great deal of discord. And then lastly, this Missouri Compromise and having to deal with the question of whether or not states that enter into the Union in the West are going to be slave states or free states causes a lot of tension between various groups of people. When we look at the domestic policies of James Monroe, although the Democratic Republicans were now the only active national party, its leaders incorporated major economic policies that had been favored by Federalists since the time of Alexander Hamilton, and President Monroe continued the policies that were begun by Madison at the end of his presidency to build up an American system of national economic development. One of the things that is realized by politicians and businessmen throughout the United States after the War of 1812 is that we're moving into a newly industrialized age, and we really had inadequate transportation and financial systems. So Henry Clay, whom we talked about with the War of 1812 as being one of those war hawks, actually proposes the American system. And at this point, he's working in the House of Representatives, and he gains the nickname the Great Compromiser. And this American system to nationalize the American economy really has a three-pronged approach. The first is the Tariff of 1816, which is implemented to promote and protect American industry. The second is to charter a second Bank of the United States to bolster the economy. And then the third is to improve transportation systems, including federal subsidies for roads and canals and other internal improvements to develop profitable markets for agriculture and a good way of getting products from one place to the other. Ironically, the Second Bank of the United States was actually supported by the same Republicans who had opposed the First Bank of the United States, and it was the Federalists this time who were actually decrying the bank as being unconstitutional. And there are several reasons why the bank actually is necessary after the War of 1812, because during the war, the United States experienced severe inflation and had a lot of difficulty in financing military operations. So the federal government had to borrow money from the state governments, which after the war, of course, they needed to pay back with greater interest. And there's really this banking vacuum that occurs during the war in which local banks start to spring up all over the country when there's not one national bank, and the country begins to be flooded by these depreciated banknotes that hamper the war effort. And so this bank is actually modeled after the first national bank, but it has 3.5 times more capital with $35 million worth. And the Jeffersonians are, of course, wanting to create this bank, and it's James Madison and his Congress that agrees to charter the bank for the next 20 years. For its part, the Tariff of 1816 was created to protect U.S. manufacturing from all of the British competitors. And one of the reasons for this is because after the War of 1812, Great Britain started to flood the United States market with cheap goods, and often these would be sold below cost in order to undercut the new U.S. industries. And so Americans saw this as a British attempt to crush United States factories and manufacturing, and also there could really be political implications for this. If the United States economy was devastated enough, then Great Britain could come back in and retake control of the North American continent. So the Tariff of 1816 was enacted in order to kind of get our stuff together, and it's really the first protective tariff in U.S. history. It imposed about 20 to 25% duties on imports, which really wasn't high enough to provide effective protection, but it did start this protective trend in U.S. trade that's going to go on throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. As you might expect, there was a sectional battle that began over this Tariff of 1816, and it was between three great congressional leaders of this antebellum period, which includes John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay, and they're known collectively as the Great Triumvirate. And John C. Calhoun, who's from South Carolina, represents the Southern views. He is a recent war hawk and an ardent nationalist, and although he initially supported the tariff, he opposed it, eventually claiming that it was enriching the Yankee manufacturers of New England. Daniel Webster, on the other hand, is from New Hampshire, so he represented Northern views, and he was also opposed to the tariff. He believed that the shippers in New Hampshire feared that the tariff would affect their carrying trade, and New England was not completely developed in manufacturing at this point. Lastly, we've got Henry Clay, who of course supports the tariff because he's the one who proposed the American system, and he sees it as a way to develop a profitable home market. He believes that the Eastern trade will flourish under this protection, and that tariff revenues can be used to fund roads and canals in the interior, especially throughout the Ohio Valley. And then frontier folks really cried for better transportation because there were very poor roads that existed, and this would be a way to fulfill their needs. Lastly, Clay believed that foodstuffs and raw material from the South and the West could flow into the North and the East and connect the country if they were able to use the revenue from this tariff for good purposes. So in 1817, John C. Calhoun proposes that the revenue bonus from the Bank of the United States could actually go towards internal improvements. But there were a lot of issues surrounding this bonus bill, and they include the fact that there are some sectional rivalries amongst the Federalists, where the older Eastern states are afraid that this is going to provide the means for Easterners to travel out west and to drain their population and to create competing states in settled areas. And then Jeffersonian Democrats are worried that federal support is actually a states' rights issue and something that the states should be handling, and that it will enlarge the federal government too much. And then there are questions about the bill's constitutionality. So Madison and Monroe both vetoed this legislation whenever it was brought in front of them. It would be easy to assume that once President Monroe vetoed this bill, that there weren't going to be a whole lot of opportunities for the federal government to support the growth of infrastructure. But history actually took an unexpected turn when on March 14th of 1818, the House of Representatives passed a resolution, and they declared that Congress had the power to appropriate money for the construction of roads and canals and for the improvement of watercourses. And on May 4th of 1822, Monroe vetoed a bill to fund and collect tolls on the Cumberland Road, but in an unprecedented step, the president also used this occasion to present a report titled Views of the President of the United States on the Subject of Internal Improvements. And the reason that this is important is because in the document, Monroe makes it very clear that while the Constitution does not empower Congress to establish any system of internal improvements, he stated that to the appropriation of the public money to improvements, I do not see any well-founded constitutional objection. And with that statement, Monroe now held that Congress had the power to appropriate public money at its discretion, and that though it was in duty bound to select objects of general importance, it was not the province of the president to sit in judgment upon its selections. So from this point on, Congress now will have the power to ensure upkeeps of roads and canals and of internal waterways. Despite the steps that were taken by the American system, there was a devastating economic panic and a depression that hit in the year 1819, and this is the first financial panic since that critical period of the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation. And we'll see that panics and depressions really occur about every 20 years, so 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, then 1907, and the big one, the Great Depression, in 1929 it begins. So this panic of 1819 really marks the end of this economic expansion following the War of 1812 and the birth of new financial policies that would shape economic development for the next century. So if we look at the precursor to the Panic of 1819, we want to be able to understand what causes it. And the Public Land Act of 1800, under this, the federal government had been very generously extending credit. And a lot of Southerners had moved into Mississippi and Alabama as a result of this, and they began to grow cotton there. Westerners started to speculate in public lands, and a lot of banks, both state and unchartered banks, actually sprang up, and these were called wildcat banks. They fed this expansionist frenzy by printing a ton of paper money, and the Western banks were especially reckless with this. So as the number of banks grew, so did the prices, especially of real estate. But the problem with this is that this very booming economy was supported by paper currency without any hard currency, which is called specie, to support it. And so many individuals and businesses fell into this very heavy debt due to this mania for expansion and growth. The boom that had been fueled by cheap land and high commodity prices and this easy credit burst in 1819. And this is very similar to that credit bubble that burst before the American Revolution. There were sudden changes also in the policies by the Second Bank of the United States. They stopped all loans as a result of this. They called in specie from various state banks who could not meet their demands, and so the hard currency dried up, and the Bank of the United States refused to honor drafts that were drawn on its branches in the South and the West. So if you went in to pull out your money, they just refused to give you any. And the bank was concerned primarily with its own finances. The Bank of the United States was far more interested in making profits for stockholders than in regulating the dangerous practices of these reckless wildcat banks, and it had just left them to essentially do whatever they wanted to. Part of the issue with the Panic of 1819 is the court case of McCulloch v. Maryland, and at issue in the case was the constitutionality of the Act of Congress chartering the Second Bank of the United States. And although the bank was controlled by private stockholders, it was the depository of federal funds. In addition, it had the authority to issue notes that, along with the notes of states banks, circulated as legal tender. And in return for its privileged position, the bank agreed to loan the federal government money in lieu of taxes. State banks really looked at the Bank of the United States as a competitor, and they resented its privileged position within the country. So when these state banks began to fall into depression, they actually blamed their troubles on the Bank of the United States. And one such state was Maryland, and so they imposed a hefty tax on any bank that was not chartered within the state. So the Bank of the United States was the only bank of Baltimore's branch that refused to pay the tax. And so Maryland sued James McCulloch, the cashier for the branch, for collection of this debt. And he responded that the tax was unconstitutional. A state court ruled for Maryland, and then the Court of Appeals affirmed. He appealed even further to the U.S. Supreme Court, which reviewed the case in 1819. And in a unanimous opinion written by Chief Justice Marshall, the court ruled that the Bank of the United States was constitutional and that Maryland tax was unconstitutional. Concerning the power of Congress to charter a bank, the court turned to the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, which expressly grants Congress the power to pass laws necessary and proper for the execution of its enumerated powers. There are several impacts of the Panic of 1819, as first of all it resulted in calls for reform and pressure for increased democracy, and at this point Western farmers began to view banks as evil financial monsters. And as usual, the hardest hit were the poor people, and they were now looking for a more responsive government. And this is probably the beginnings of Jacksonian democracy that can be found in these issues, and we'll talk more about this next week. Also, new land legislation resulted in smaller parcels being sold for lower prices, and by the time we get to the Civil War, Western land would be given away nearly for free. There was now widespread sentiment to end the practice of imprisoning debtors, and Monroe did very little to stop this panic, which didn't make him look very good. He did pass a law lowering the price of public lands in 1820, but the federal government maintained this strict policy of not interfering in economic matters that it believed was beyond its constitutional powers. And the reason for this is because Democratic Republicans feared that any expansion of the powers of a national government might someday threaten slavery. Despite his role in the Panic of 1819, Monroe was actually re-elected in 1820 with all but one electoral vote, and he's the only president in history to be elected after a major panic for a second time. So the West at this point was growing rapidly, and new states had very similar characteristics. They were not focused on states' rights issues like the South and the East. They received most of their land from the federal government, so they were more dependent on the government. They contained a wide diversity of people immigrating from the East as well. So 9 new Western states joined the Union between 1791 and 1819, and most of these had been admitted alternately free and slave, And maintaining this sectional balance in Congress was really the supreme goal. There are really a lot of reasons why people began to move westward, and westward expansion has been a significant trend since the colonial era. If you remember way back in 1763, after the French and Indian War, Great Britain had actually imposed the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and it had forbade any Anglo-American settlers from actually settling past a line that was drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, as there had been a great deal of problems with these Anglo-Americans encroaching on Native American territory. And as we move further into the 19th century, this cheap land that was in the Ohio Territory attracted thousands of European immigrants. And in addition, a lot of the land in the southern states had been exhausted by the tobacco fields, and so it drove people westward. And those people in the southern states who couldn't get land because it had all been doled out were also moving and looking for their piece of this pie. And then speculators accepted very small down payments on land, which would make it much easier for these people to purchase land and to begin their new Western life. And then the last piece of this puzzle is that the economic depression during the embargo years under Jefferson's presidency had really sparked a great deal of migration westward as people were looking for new opportunities and new possibilities for success. The transportation revolution is also another reason for increased westward expansion, and it brought about improved land routes to the Ohio Valley. And we'll speak more about the transportation revolution in a couple of weeks, but just briefly for now, it brings about the Cumberland Road, which is our first national road in the United States, and this opens in 1811, and it connects people all the way from Maryland to Illinois. We also have the advent of the steamboat in 1811. In October of this year, a ship designed by John Stevens called Little Juliana would operate as the first steam-powered ferry between Hoboken and New York City, and this actually made upstream travel possible for the first time. And then lastly, canals beginning in 1826 allowed for increased trade between the West and the East. Another issue that really begins to rip through the fabric of America at this point is slavery, and the issue is going to become more and more pronounced as we move through the 19th century towards the American Civil War. So in 1808, Congress abolished the slave trade with very little resistance. And in abolishing the slave trade, they made it illegal to import more slaves, but they certainly didn't forbid or outlaw actually having slaves in southern states and using their labor. By 1819, there are 11 free states and 11 slave states, so it's equal. And then you start to see at this point this sort of north-south or free slave divide, which is going to take on this epic proportion and lead to the Civil War. The West, for the most part, supports slavery because most pioneers were from slave states like Virginia and from Kentucky. Missouri is the first area west of the Mississippi River to apply for statehood, and in response to this, the House of Representatives passed the Talmadge Amendment, and Missouri asked the Congress to enter the Union in 1819. And as part of this amendment, which was actually brought forth by James Talmadge, who wanted to extinguish slavery in Missouri within a generation, the amendment said that no more slaves could be brought into Missouri, and it also called for the gradual emancipation of children born to slave parents who were already living in that area. It's probably not surprising that Southerners viewed the Talmadge Amendment as a huge threat to sectional balance, And if you remember, there are 2 senators that are granted per state regardless of size, but the number of seats that a state has in the House of Representatives is based on their population. And because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, 5 slaves count as 3 free men. So the population of the North at this point was growing more quickly than that of the South. And with the South having so many slaves, they had a lower countable populace than in the North. And Southerners really feared that the passage of this amendment would restrict the weight of the slaveholding South in the Union when it came to political decisions. And this led to a lot of concern about the future of the slave system. Missouri was the first state that was entirely west of the Mississippi, made from the Louisiana Territory, that had been bought by Thomas Jefferson. And the Talmadge Amendment might set a precedent for the rest of that region to be free when it entered into statehood. So if Congress could abolish slavery in Missouri, then it might also try in southern states in addition. And so the Senate refused to pass the amendment for these reasons, and a national crisis loomed as a result. So if you remember, we previously talked about Henry Clay, the great compromiser, and once again he worked to negotiate a compromise known as the Missouri Compromise. And based on his suggestion, Congress agreed to admit Missouri as a slave state, and in order to maintain the balance of slave and free states, they admitted Maine as a free state. And this balance of 12 free states and 12 slave states stood in place for the next 15 years and helped us to avoid further conflict. So, in addition, the Missouri Compromise prohibited slavery north of the 3630 parallel, which is the southern border of Missouri, and it leaves Missouri above it and sort of sticking out like a sore thumb. The compromise was largely accepted by both sides because the South got Missouri, even though it was actually above the delineated parallel, and Northerners had won the concession that it could forbid slavery in the remaining territories above that 3630 line of demarcation. So Southerners were not too concerned about the land north of that parallel because the climate was not really conducive to cash crop agriculture that required slave labor. And in the end, everyone was pretty happy with this. The legacy of the Missouri Compromise is that it lasted for another 34 years until the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. But the issue of slavery had become a dominant issue in American politics, and this was a serious setback to national unity. And after this, the South began to develop a sectional nationalism of its own, and it had a hierarchy that was based on subjugation that was very much rooted in slavery. The South then looked to the Western states who were seeking allies in order to bring them into this slave state versus free state kind of issue. And Henry Clay is later going to be criticized by Northerners as being an appeaser. The last issue of Monroe's domestic policy for us to talk about is John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And some historians, many in fact, would argue that Marshall's the most important Chief Justice in U.S. history, and he sits as the justice from 1801 to 1835. If you remember from discussing the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, he significantly strengthened the Supreme Court in the Marbury v. Madison case, in which they established the precedent of judicial review. And his decisions greatly increased the power of the federal government over the states. He strengthened the Union and helped create a stable, nationally uniform environment for business. He checked the excesses of the popularly elected state legislatures. And ironically, his decisions at times hampered democracy at a time when America was becoming much more democratic during the later Jacksonian era. And then finally, Marshall was known for examining cases from a Federalist philosophy, and he found legal precedents to support his Hamiltonian views. And Jeffersonian attempts to try and balance out the court with Democratic Republicans really failed. And Republicans came to accept the Federalist idea of a strong central government, probably because of the leadership of John Marshall. Alright, so the last thing to discuss for President Monroe is his foreign policy, and we can start with the Rush-Bagot Agreement or the Rush-Bagot Treaty that was signed in 1818, and this was a limited naval armament of the Great Lakes, and so it provided for a large demilitarization of the Great Lakes and of Lake Champlain, where many British naval arrangements and forts still remained after the War of 1812. And this really lays the basis for a demilitarized boundary between the United States and British North America. By 1879, the US and Canada shared the longest unfortified border in the world at about 5.5 thousand miles. The Treaty of 1818 was signed with England, and it was negotiated by the Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who is one of our greatest diplomats, and it fixed the America-Canada border at the 49th parallel from Lake of the Woods to the Rocky Mountains, and we would hold a 10-year joint occupation of Oregon according to this treaty without surrender of our claims. And in addition, America would begin to share Newfoundland fisheries with Canada. It was during this time period that the United States also gained Florida, and the U.S. had already claimed western Florida, where settlers forcibly arrived in 1810, and Congress ratified the conquest during the War of 1812. Then, because of revolutions in South America, they forced Spain to move troops out of Florida. And so Native Americans, runaway slaves, and white outcasts poured across the border to attack settlers and flee south of that border. So President Monroe ordered Andrew Jackson to attack the natives and, if necessary, pursue them back into Florida. And of course, this is during the First Seminole War, where Jackson sweeps them back between the year of 1816 and 1818. And in fact, it's during this time that he disobeys Monroe's orders and actually captures Spanish cities and deposes the Spanish governor. Jackson then goes out in this form of vigilante justice and executes 2 Native American chiefs. So John Quincy Adams stepped in with this brilliant idea. He said to tell Spain that they had to control their outlaws or cede Florida to the United States. And since Spain couldn't control the area, they decided to negotiate. The Adams-Onis Treaty, or the Florida Purchase Treaty, was what allowed the United States to buy Florida for just $5 million. And in exchange, the U.S. abandoned claims to Texas, and Spain ceded Florida and claims to Oregon in the United States. When we look at the role of Native Americans in procuring Florida, there's really a devastating impact on them. General Andrew Jackson had become a hero first after his victory in the Creek War at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and you'll learn much more about Jackson next week. But he goes in and he forces the Treaty of Fort Jackson on the Creek people, and this causes a lot of them to lose their homes in Georgia and Alabama, and the only thing they know to do is to flee down to Seminole territory. Florida has for a long time been a refuge for slaves and for Native Americans. Slaves can't be found there once the Fugitive Slave Law is passed. They can't be brought out of Spain and back into the United States because it's a separate country. And Native Americans can let go of the treaties that they have with the United States if they're moving into this foreign territory. So General Jackson decides he's going to follow the Creek as they make their way down to the Seminoles, and he follows them down to a fort along the Apalachicola River called the Negro Fort that holds runaway African Americans and Native Americans, and Jackson destroys the fort. He kills many people, and in fact he just slaughters thousands of warriors there. So once Jackson gets down into Florida, we see the beginning of the First Seminole War. And there are several causes for this war. The United States, first of all, wants the land that the Seminoles live on, but the Seminoles, of course, won't leave, and by engaging in warfare, the U.S. can simply get rid of them. The United States also wanted the Seminole to trade only with Americans and not with other countries, which is certainly not the practice of the tribe. And then lastly, as we've mentioned, escaped slaves would flee down to Florida and they would join the Seminole tribe and they would intermarry with them and live there quite peacefully. And the United States wanted these slaves returned to their owners. So the First Seminole War began in 1817, and it was a conflict that broke out along the Florida-Georgia border, and Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida to put it down, and he destroyed the villages of Seminoles and of African Americans throughout Florida. So during this First Seminole War, Jackson recruits Native Americans. He, as we said before, executes 2 British traders who he believes were inciting the raids without permission. He also captures several Spanish forts when he's supposed to be keeping the peace, and he deposes the Spanish governor. He disobeys his president, and he invades Florida without permission. His aim, of course, is to get the African Americans and the Native Americans out so that the United States can buy the land and settle on it. So it's at this point in 1821, as you remember, that the United States basically tells Spain that they need to control their outlaws in Florida or they need to cede the territory. And because Spain is dealing with revolutions back at home, they realize that they should go ahead and negotiate, and they give up their claim to Florida for $5 million. In the meantime, the U.S. government also signs a treaty with the Seminole people, the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. And in this treaty, they take the Seminole people and they put them on a reservation in central Florida. And they put them in this area because they want to make sure they're not close to the coast so they can't trade with Cuba or the Bahamas. And the U.S. government is supposed to distribute farm implements, cattle, and hogs to the Seminole, compensate them for travel and losses involved in relocating to the reservation, and provide rations for a year until the Seminoles can plant and harvest new crops. The U.S. government is also supposed to pay the tribe $5,000 a year for 20 years and provide an interpreter, a school, and a blacksmith for the same amount of years. In turn, the Seminole have to allow roads to be built across their reservation and have to apprehend any runaway slaves or other fugitives and return them to U.S. jurisdiction. So you'll notice I've said several times that the U.S. government is supposed to do these things, and you'll find in our ensuing lectures that many, if not most, of the treaties with Native Americans were not upheld by the U.S. government. Probably one of the most important things for you to remember about Monroe's foreign policy, and indeed probably one of the most important things in this entire PowerPoint, is the Monroe Doctrine, because it's going to be the foundation for America's foreign policy for the next century. And the Monroe Doctrine is passed because at this point in history, the United States is afraid of the Quadruple Alliance, and the Quadruple Alliance was the alliance of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and France, and the U.S. was afraid that they might attempt to regain Latin America. Also, the United States feared this disruption of trade security. So in 1821, Russia signed the Edict of 1821, and they extended Alaska south of the 51st parallel into Oregon territory, and they claimed that Oregon was an open field of colonization, which of course the United States believed was rightfully theirs, and it really disturbed them. Now, Britain also shared these fears with the United States of this quadruple alliance, and they told the United States they wanted an alliance with us. The problem is that the United States worried that Britain only wanted an alliance because they wanted to stop the United States from expanding into Latin America. And remember, at this point there were revolutions going on and a great deal of political instability, and it was very possible that the United States could move down into the territory and begin to conquer it. So John Quincy Adams, remembering Washington's farewell address with that warning against entangling alliances that might force the United States into costly wars, goes and advises Monroe to do something about this, but he says, don't do it with Britain. We can't trust them. The Monroe Doctrine is articulated in President Monroe's annual message to Congress in 1823, and in this message he warned that Europeans should not go into the Western Hemisphere any longer, and that it was no longer open for exploration or colonization. He said that attempts by foreign powers to interfere with the Western Hemisphere would be considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, and the U.S. would take action to protect its national security. He also said that the United States would not interfere with European colonies that were already established, and that the U.S. would not interfere with the internal affairs of European nations. So essentially what the Monroe Doctrine creates is a policy of isolationism, but it was difficult to back this kind of a statement without military force, and the United States didn't have a military that compared to Europe at all. But the doctrine was respected by Europeans because they feared Great Britain, not because they feared the United States. Great Britain wanted to protect the lucrative markets that Latin America provided them, and that would only work if Latin America was independent from the United States. And so they supported a doctrine that would allow them access to these markets. And other nations were very wary of forcing Great Britain into an alliance with the United States, and so they backed off and allowed this isolationist policy to exist. The immediate impact of the Monroe Doctrine was actually fairly small. Russia signed the treaty in 1824, and it gave up its claims to the Oregon Territory, and it left just the United States and Great Britain fighting about Oregon. The U.S. Army and Navy remained small and relatively weak, and it became more important when President Polk revived it in 1845. Now, the long-term impact of the policy was very significant. It served as the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy during the last half of the 19th century throughout the 20th century, and the United States becomes this watchman for Latin America as they don't want other nations interfering with their strategic Caribbean possessions, and it was really used as an excuse for U.S. imperialism in the early 20th century.